Welcome once again to teleSUR English. We go live to Mexico as the 115th anniversary of the beginning of the Mexican Revolution is being celebrated with a military parade. We were just listening from the words of President Claudia Sheinbaum as she addressed this military parade, congratulated at this historical event the members of the different forces of the armed forces of Mexico. She was recalling the importance, the significance of this historical event that was the Mexican Revolution, the armed uprising that in 1910 lifted in arms against the regime of Porfirio Diaz. She was very emphatic in the characterization of that state, of that regime of Porfirio Diaz as a government that was handing over natural resources to foreign powers, that was also displacing indigenous populations, taking those lands, taking those resources from those indigenous populations and putting them in the hands of the foreign powers, of the foreign capitals that were pressuring and colluding with that government, and also with the objective of making themselves with those resources and that wealth of the Mexican people. She was also describing the model of the Porfirio Diaz government progress as a false progress, as it was just benefiting a few, the elites. And that was what called for that uprising that was led and began in 1910. We were saying one of the most important historical events in significance, not only for the country, for the region, but also for the world, one of the most significant revolutions worldwide for the 20th century, marking at the beginning of that century, right next to the Russian Revolution, from two ends of the world, the significance of the struggle of the peoples in the fight for a more equitable society, for a more equitable distribution of power. And that was called for by the Mexican Revolution. And of course, the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, was making a point of this characterization, also thinking about the implications that it continues to have today in the government of Mexico, stating that she was calling for continuous loyalty to the people. She was stating that whoever is today asking for oppression to those peoples of the country and peoples of the world was recalling that model that was left behind by the Mexican Revolution and later on by the Mexican Constitution that upheld those ideals of the revolution marked by the beginning of that 20th century. So she was stating that anyone calling for more police brutality, anyone calling to oppress and to persecute the peoples of Mexico was calling for that model, and that Mexico had surpassed that model, that the government, and particularly her government and continuation of the model of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, was standing with the people. She was stating also that with the people, everything could be done in Mexico. Without the people, nothing. Never again would Mexico promote a government that benefit the elites and oppress the people. Another one of the characteristics that were being pointed out was the significance of how the foreign powers were playing during that moment right before the Mexican Revolution in terms of trying to seek those natural resources and appropriate those natural resources from the Mexican people, and how the Mexican Revolution and the Constitution that came afterwards and the governments that later on, such as Cárdenas, took from that revolution the mandate of upholding those values, managed to, in spite of the pressures of the foreign powers of the world, be able to bring back and maintain the natural resources, the natural wealth of Mexico to the state of Mexico, to the people of Mexico, and give that to its own population as one of the most important sovereign mandates of the country. Of course, this has a new relevance at this moment when the dispute over natural resources is one of the most pressing issues worldwide at a geopolitical level all across the world, but particularly in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, with an ongoing military aggression in the Caribbean region, also in the Pacific region, that the United States, with this new administration of Donald Trump in its second term, is trying to pose as an alleged war on drugs. But many experts and also politicians and also social leaders from both outside and inside the United States are saying that it's not a war on drugs, but rather a war in order to secure the natural resources of Latin American and Caribbean nations, in this case Venezuela, but also other nations such as Colombia, that really hold true wealth throughout its territories. We've been seeing throughout the century the disposition of the United States to think of the natural resources of Latin America and the Caribbean as its own hemisphere, its own backyard, as the Monroe Doctrine set it up, and theirs to take. That sovereign claim that upholds the necessity of Latin American nations of defending their resources in the face of the foreign powers, that is also a significant point of that Mexican Revolution that continues to illuminate and continues to shine on the necessities of the present. And it makes sense that President Claudia Sheinbaum would point to such aspects. Let's listen to some of what is happening at this moment in Mexico. Again, we are live.
¡Viva la democracia y la justicia social!
La primera chispa del movimiento armado se dio en casa de los hermanos Cerdán, quienes al ser atacados en su domicilio acudieron al llamado de Madero.
Once again, we continue to look at images. We are live in Mexico. We are looking at images of this military parade. We recall this is the 115th anniversary of the Mexican Revolution, that armed uprising against the regime of Porfirio Diaz that took place in 1910 and would end in 1917, those years of struggle that reshaped the political and social landscape of Mexico as a whole, and would pose a new way of understanding the power from the bottom up. President Claudia Sheinbaum addressed the parade just minutes ago and was also highlighting this particular point that was brought by the Mexican Revolution, the idea that power is not and cannot be thought of as something that is exercised from the elites, from the upper sectors of society, but something that is built from the bottom ground, from the grassroots of society. That is something that was built with that fight, with that struggle of rural workers at that moment that took arms in the Mexican Revolution, and continues to be a paradigm and also just an objective, a goal that is followed and was followed in the decades to come by different sectors of Mexican politics, and also was an example and a beacon for different movements across Latin America in particular, and the Caribbean region as well. Let's recall the way that President Claudia Sheinbaum was just describing the regime of Porfirio Díaz, that moment, that regime to which this armed struggle was lifted and was presented. She was describing that government, that fraudulent government that was maintaining power without respecting the popular election and the popular vote, as a government that was, as we were mentioning, handed over the natural resources of the country to foreign powers, thinking about and putting at the forefront the interests of an elite that was basically based around the cities, the main urban centers of the country, while the indigenous populations, so important for Mexican society and Mexican tradition and way of life, were being displaced, were being taken away from their own lands, where rural workers in particular were severely oppressed, both from their inability to own the land that they worked, but also through incredibly low salaries that barely allowed them to live day to day, dispossessed them of all the work and wealth they were building as the workers that truly labored that land. That model that was described as a model of false progress because it was only benefiting a few in that Mexico at the beginning of the 20th century was interrupted, and it was interrupted by an armed uprising that was led by those sectors, different sectors of those same rural workers that started to take matters into their own hands, shaping a new society that was brought about by an intense struggle that took years. We were saying that the process lasted at least those first 7 years until 1917 and continued afterwards with the reconfiguration of power. It would take the government of Lázaro Cárdenas to come back to that constitution of 1917 that was so inspired on the principles of that Mexican Revolution to put together and bring to reality many of those commitments of the Mexican Revolution, many of those principles that sought to, for example, reinstate ownership of broad sectors of land, housing, to those rural sectors of the Mexican society, putting those sectors of the population at the forefront of the political decisions and political benefits of the Mexican society. That was shaped by that Constitution of 1917. President Claudia Sheinbaum was just, when she was addressing this parade, let's recall we're looking at live images from Mexico at the parade for the 115th anniversary of the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. President Claudia Sheinbaum was highlighting the progressiveness of that Constitution of 1917, the way that it was worldwide, a constitution that shaped rights that would then become a norm for many sectors of the world that today in the 21st century continue to be the rights for which workers across the world and peoples across the world are working towards and continue to defend. Items, for example, linked to the 8-hour workday and many other rights that were being shaped by the 1917 Constitution that was brought about in Mexico. And that was brought about by that armed uprising led by the people, by the Mexican people, a movement that also reshaped the way in which power is located within the country, and that also reshaped the way that this is looked upon from different sectors of the world. We were saying that in front of those elites that were settled in the city, the revolution brought from the rural areas towards the city centers these ideas of revolution, of change, of the need of building a more fair and equitable society. And that cry was being brought from those rural areas and ended up heavily impacting the elites at the city centers, that never again in Mexico, but this would have consequences beyond the Mexican borders, particularly in the Latin American and Caribbean region, as one of the most important revolutions worldwide. Never again could the urban elites from the cities completely disregard the populations at the rural areas of the country. The Mexican Revolution in this way was also a moment in which to think, where does the power on a society, where is it located, where does it come from? Well, the Mexican Revolution came from those fields and towards those centers, reshaping the way that that power was being set and forever changing that balance that would, of course, be continued and in an ongoing reconfiguration for what came of the 20th century. At the closing of her speech, the President Claudia Sheinbaum was also highlighting and saluting Zapata, so important for that continuation in Mexican political history of what would be then the struggle to always come back and uphold those ideals, those principles of that Mexican Revolution in a constant and permanent struggle between the revolutionary impulse and the institutionalizing impulse that, of course, is always tending to once again reinstate those same elites at the urban centers, in particular Mexico. Over 1 century after that beginning of the Mexican Revolution is facing a new geopolitical context. It's facing new challenges, many along the same lines. That's why President Claudia Sheinbaum was highlighting those commonalities, those common points between what that Mexican Revolution was tending up against, that Porfirio Diaz regime that was putting foreign interest before the interest of the population, between the sovereignty of the Mexican state over, for example, its natural wealth. That is, in another way, in another century, the same problem that Latin America and the Caribbean region is facing today. In a new geopolitical context, Mexico continues to deal with different challenges. And that was what the president was recalling at this important address, as once again we continue to look at this 115th anniversary of the Mexican Revolution.
Como en toda organización, en las fuerzas militares,
We're looking at
existe
this
un
parade,
responsable
this
del
military parade that is a celebration, a commemoration of the beginning in 1910 of that Mexican Revolution that began against the government of Porfirio Diaz over 115 years ago today, November 20th. Let's recall that that date marked the beginning of struggle against that dictatorship and had been summoned by Don Francisco Madero on that November 20th of 1910. The conflict, the armed conflict that would follow and that would characterize this Mexican Revolution would lead to different combats, years of struggles throughout different regions of Mexico that were led, among others, by Pascual Orozco, Francisco Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and whose victories and military victories later on forced the resignation of Porfirio Diaz, who later on was forced to flee to exile. We were saying that President Sheinbaum recalled Zapata at her final salute when she was closing her address, as we continue to look at live images of that parade. The importance of Zapata and his continued influence is maybe one of the most significant names to recall. What that revolution, Mexican Revolution, did and proposed as a principle at the beginning of the 20th century and would continue to shape the Mexican struggles of different sectors of society, coming back to those principles as far as the late 20th century, with a high point during the 90s, with an important presence, an important influence of Zapatism throughout Latin American and Caribbean regions, so important in the reshaping of a Latin American unity and new way of thinking about popular power that influenced social movements and continues to be a beacon for social movements across the territory. Maybe one of the names that better describes how that Mexican Revolution that today is marking 115 years of the beginning of that armed uprising not only changed the political path for Mexico, shaping its permanent commitment, one that the later government of Claudia Sheinbaum, in this case, also President Andrés Manuel López Obrador before her, had as flagship ideals the importance of maintaining sovereignty, national resources, the importance of building from the popular power with the people, the importance of looking at ways of redistributing power and the access of the people to its own resources, the importance of caring for the tranquility of that population, and always the goal forever with an importance and the ideal, the objective of perfecting the goal of a more equitable society. That was marked with those principles of the Mexican Revolution, but that revolution expanded beyond the borders of Mexico and set the ideals of a new way of thinking about political struggle, a new way of thinking about political power from the bottom up, from the grassroots movements that truly impacted social movements across the continent in particular. The importance of the influence of that revolution on this hemisphere, a revolution in Latin American terms, is sometimes forgotten when we think about the major revolutions worldwide. Today, it's the day to really highlight how this process that was happening within our own territories, within our own continent, was of most significant influence for what happened afterwards, for the development of a 20th century that saw the biggest struggles across the Latin American and Caribbean region in defense of a sovereign model of popular power, of people thinking about ways of organizing themselves in order to impose a model that would benefit not only the elites that are always in collusion with foreign powers or foreign interests, but a model that would put the ideals and the rights of the peoples of those countries in the forefront. Of course, one of the most significant moments of that tradition that would be forged throughout the 20th century in Latin America would be the Cuban Revolution. And that would continue in different nations with social movements and political movements that would in different ways try to replicate some of these principles that would lead to different forms of thinking about the way in which the state needed to put the people at the forefront, and that would also lead to violent struggles and a violent backlash by those same foreign powers, in this case the United States at the forefront of those, both by direct invasions in several countries in the Central American region and the Caribbean in particular, and also through other very violent processes as were the military dictatorships in the southern region of the continent. All of those could be thought of in the wider framework of a struggle being led throughout the continent from the peoples of Latin America trying to fight for their sovereignty against the impositions of foreign powers, and those same global elites trying to impose their own versions of powers against the needs of those peoples, the workers of Latin American and the Caribbean. That back and forth that took different shapes and led to different destinies across the continent, that at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century would see new proposals of a greater homeland and stronger unity and integration led by different leaders that always came back to the importance of the social movements. All of that long history of Latin American struggle and Latin American integration to this day cannot underestimate the importance of that Mexican Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century that gave way and was a pivotal moment to understand everything that came after that. Let's continue to recall we're looking at this parade. We're live from Mexico as we see the images of the people dressed in traditional garments as they celebrate, they commemorate over a century, 115 years after the beginning of what would be a transcendental moment, struggle, an armed uprising of the Mexican Revolution that would reshape the way that one of the most important in terms of population, market share, productivity, one of the most significant states of the region, one that afterwards would be home, for example, to many of the militants and activists across the continent that would be forced into exile and would find a place in Mexico. People from the southern regions of Latin America, people from the Caribbean, and all across the continent would find in Mexico a place in order to meet, continue to learn from these ideas, and they were nourished by the principles of that Mexican Revolution that continued to shape that political landscape of what was Mexico. That would then transcend into the different territories. We cannot avoid and just forget to mention that the Cuban Revolution had an important moment before it came to be at the Cuban island of those militants, those who would become later on the leaders of the revolution, meeting in Mexico, being in exile in Mexico and gathering and forging those ideas and those plans in that border next to militants and intellectuals from Argentina, from Chile, from different countries across the continent. None of that can underestimate the importance that this moment, that the Mexican Revolution had for the dreams of a more equitable, a more fair society in what is the region of that greater homeland, the Latin American and Caribbean region. Let's continue to look at these images as the people are marching. These are live images from Mexico. Once again, an important day. We were listening from President Claudia Sheinbaum just moments ago. She was addressing the square, the most important square of Mexico at this moment. We are now looking at the parade that is representing pivotal moments of that Mexican Revolution, of how that came to be. Looking at one of the chariots that is inscribed as the first martyrs of the revolution. One of the highlights, one of the points that the President of Mexico was making in her address, we went over some of the most important things that she was saying, how coming back to that revolutionary process was so important to understand the principles that were guiding her government at this moment, and that was also guiding the entirety, different sectors of the Mexican society at this moment. And she was also mentioning the importance of this day in terms of recalling and commemorating all of those people who gave their lives, many rural workers, men and women, who were giving their lives in hopes of a better future. For them, it is. She was saying that Mexico continues to build on that new society. We're looking at the parade as the different scenes of that Mexican Revolution. One of them that we were just looking at pointed at the moment in which Porfirio Diaz is finally forced to resign. Let's recall a regime that was marked by fraud, that was maintaining power at the beginning of the 20th century through its collusion and corruption linked to an elite that was benefiting from the negotiations and works that they were leading, also in collusion with foreign capitals, foreign powers, exploiting the natural resources only in benefit of a few, and without respecting the democratic mandate of the ballots, of the wishes of Mexican people. This process of the Mexican Revolution, of the armed conflict that led to that constitution that finally marked the beginning of a new era, the beginning of a new process, one of the most progressive constitutions that was also highlighted by the President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum. That moment that places the rights of the people at the forefront, the importance of sovereignty, the importance that Mexico has continued to maintain in terms of defending not only the sovereign wishes of its own people, the necessity of upholding their own rights to the natural resources, the importance and the necessity of a country and a nation of just negotiating as equals with any powers across the world. Let's recall that the political landscape of Mexico is always marked by the relationship with its powerful neighbor, the United States. And of course, the difference lies in the way in which they are able to sit down as equals to negotiate in the sovereign interest of each state, or the model of a government that seeks to benefit a few elites while giving up its sovereign rights, giving up its sovereign resources to the benefit as well of that foreign capital. All of that comes back to this moment, this Mexican Revolution that today marks just the beginning of it in 1910, 115 years. Today, on November 20th, we continue to see the people marching. We've seen different blocks of people. They're all dressed in traditional garments. One of the most important things as well, representing Mexican identity, representing the identity of the peoples of the state against the cosmopolitanism and the wishes of certain elites, mostly placed in big cities, that were disregarding of the traditional inheritance so important for Mexican legacy, and just favoring the powers of other nations, as for example, in this case, the United States, but also Europe. Mexico also as one of the most important key roles in order to understand the way in which the entire Latin American and Caribbean region has been dealing with and has needed to stand up and rebuild its own sovereignty from the violent conquest onward, recovering and going back to its own roots, to its own history, to its own inheritance. That is also part of its sovereignty. That is also part of the roots that were recovered at that Mexican Revolution, the possibility of forging our own destiny, with the path, with the colors, with the costumes, with the ways of the native peoples, and not of those that were dictated by big cities with bosses and powers somewhere else across the world and the foreign powers of the world. We continue to look at the people as the different sectors of the parade are moving forward. We were saying that many of those were displaying the key moments, the key images of that Mexican Revolution. We were looking at those images that marked that process, that 7-year process that would then lead into a new stage of Mexico that, of course, would also face different ways in which to come back to those principles marked by the Mexican Revolution, marked by that Constitution of 1917. All of that and the victory that was a result of that process, the victory that was that progressive constitution of shaping and putting in writing that society, the rights of the peoples, the priorities of a state would have to change, and that change was being brought about by the hands and the will of the Mexican people, of the rural workers, men and women that had decided to give up their day-to-day life in order to become involved in this process, many at the risk of their own lives, many giving everything that they had in that moment, in that process, with the hopes of forging a new destiny. What President Sheinbaum was highlighting at her address right before this moment of the parade that is happening right now and we're seeing on screen took place was the importance of understanding how much the present moment of Mexico continues to look at, to draw from, and to bring back all those principles that were conquered at that armed uprising that began in the year 1910 on November 20th, a day like today, but 115 years ago. Once again, we recall we're looking at the parade from Mexico, the parade that is commemorated the 115th anniversary of the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, a process that would mark the destiny, the fate of the Mexican nation, but also of the world. We continue to look at the different stages that are part of this parade, upholding and representing the most important parts, different aspects of what this moment of commemorating the beginning of that political process and social process that was the Mexican Revolution is all about. Upholding the national patrimony, the social patrimony. We were speaking of the importance of the Mexican Revolution in terms of reinstating and recovering the importance of managing their own resources and their own inheritance and their own culture in the face of foreign powers, in the face of foreign impositions, in the face of foreign capital that was imposing its own model and disregarding the ways, the labor, the rights of the native peoples of Mexico in general, of the different communities of rural Mexico in particular. that portion of the parade, highlighting the importance of national patrimony, was making a point of that, as was Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, as she was saying that the ongoing fight for the natural resources is something that also brings us back to those principles of the Mexican Revolution, also engraved in that 1917 Constitution, one of the most progressive worldwide at the moment, with the importance that this has as being a beacon, an objective, a goal for other movements, grassroots movements across the world, but particularly in the Latin American and Caribbean region, that saw that it was possible to come back to a way of struggle, an armed struggle, and be able to win in their proposition of reshaping the way that the state was being managed, the way that priorities were being set, the way that the wealth of the country, of the nation, was being used and decided upon. All of these are different aspects of what the Mexican Revolution is calling on Mexicans in particular today to rethink upon, and the region as a whole, as we were saying, a region that was heavily influenced by this political process across the 20th century, into the 21st century, into the socialist projects of the 20th century, as those in Cuba, in Venezuela, for example, the importance of having that precedent in our own territories, in Latin America, in a nation of such importance, and that would continue to uphold the importance of sovereignty, of nations being able to deal with their own affairs without the interference of any foreign power. Mexico would continue to be, and is until this day, an important power that continues to mark that goal, that principle of non-interference. We've been seeing it over and over in the importance of respecting national sovereignty across the region. The claims and the statements of now President Claudia Sheinbaum, with the situation, the ongoing military deployment of the United States in the Caribbean and also in the Pacific, and the extrajudicial executions that they have carried out, described as such by experts worldwide, UN experts in particular, illegal acts that have been carried out as a way of pressuring sovereign states in the region, forcing them into a state of needing to follow orders other than the will of their own people. Mexico has been an important partner, an important nation in their claim of continuous respect for national sovereignty. We continue to look at the images of this parade at this moment. We were listening to President Claudia Sheinbaum. Moments ago, she was addressing the beginning of this act. As we see that the parade, we were saying the Mexican Revolution in this case, had to do with everything that was upholding Mexican culture in the end, a moment that gave way to recovering, defending, and putting at the forefront everything that is truly sovereign about that state. That is why the images that we are seeing, both from the people that are walking down the streets to the people that are in the chariots that are part of that parade, are highlighting different aspects of what Mexico is today in terms of sports, of culture, of its history and traditions. That is what we are seeing at this moment. Among the phrases that were highlighted by the Mexican president, one was the call to everyone, every sector of society, to maintain loyalty to the people. That was among the principles that were left and continue to be beacon from that Mexican Revolution, the importance of continuing to follow that popular mandate at every moment of Mexican history. With the people, everything. Without the people, nothing can be done or should be done. That is what the President Claudia Sheinbaum was not only highlighting, but also committing to as one of the ideas that mark her own government, this government of Morena that continues at this moment to show very high approval ratings among the population following the great acceptance of last President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who reshaped and proposed a new way of, for example, placing a dialogue between governance and the people, the importance of permanently communicating, the importance of maintaining that permanent dialogue, a closeness with the people, with their ideals, with their motives, and their needs. That idea of shaping a government that continues to be close to its own people, that continues to give answers to their own people, also draws from the principles of that Mexican Revolution that once and for all stated that the governing elites could not be separated from the will, from the needs, from the claims of those people. That closeness was one of the characteristics that are highlighted by different sectors of Mexican society, also political analysts regarding the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Many of them place this characteristic as one of the key elements to understand his high rating of approvals. Let's recall one of the presidents that maintained those high ratings of approvals, even throughout the most challenging and pressing conflicts, as was the one of the COVID-19 pandemic that brought down many of the incumbent governments worldwide. But the Mexican government, led by Morena at this moment, and at that moment, continued to uphold those high approval ratings. In that same sense, President Sheinbaum continued his legacy, his transformation, and continued to draw from these principles. That was some of what President Sheinbaum was highlighting in her speech just moments ago when we were hearing from her before this parade that we are seeing right now. Live images from Mexico at this parade that marks the 115th anniversary of the beginning of the Mexican Revolution in the year 1910. Let's recall the Mexican Revolution, an armed uprising against the regime of Porfirio Diaz, a regime that was handing over the natural resources of the nation to foreign powers, also displacing indigenous populations, also oppressing the rural workers in different ways. Those same men and women who took matters into their own hands and decided to reshape their own destinies, and with them the destiny of the nation and the continent, with all the influence that it would have across borders. President Claudia Sheinbaum was highlighting during her speech just moments ago that model, the model represented by the regime of Porfirio Diaz, was a false progress. False because the progress was only benefiting a few members of the urban elites. And afterwards, what came was a constitution that mandated that the progress of the nation should be putting the rights of the people, the entire population, and particularly the most vulnerable, at the forefront of the efforts of the government. With the people, everything; without them, nothing, she said. And she called on everyone to maintain that loyalty, stating that never again should there be a government that sought to benefit the elites and oppress their own people. She was also making reference to current political struggle, stating that anyone who called for police brutality, that anyone who called for political persecution against their own people was calling for a regime such as the one that was countered at that Mexican Revolution to come back again. And that was what her government, the government of Claudia Sheinbaum of Morena, was precisely against. Let's recall that today, November 20th, the people of Mexico is commemorating the 115th anniversary of the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, a struggle that opened the way to social justice, to democracy, to the rights of the people. We are looking now at the images of this parade that is honoring those who with bravery, with hope, were forging a better Mexico, a Mexico that was said to be more free, more independent, more sovereign, and more dignified. Those were the principles that were set at that moment through that armed struggle, that were written down in paper at the constitution that came afterwards, that were followed by specific governments that proposed precisely to uphold those principles of the Mexican Revolution. The governments of Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum in this 21st century have proposed themselves in that line of the governments that seek to uphold, maintain those principles of the Mexican Revolution. And in that way, it was highlighted today with this parade, with the speech that we were hearing from just moments ago. The date of November 20th, 1910, marked the beginning of that process, the process of the Mexican Revolution. It was 115 years from today, from this parade that is honoring the beginning of that process and that is honoring in particular the lives of those men and women who participated in different ways in a process that tried to build and was so successful in different ways. Of course, changes would not come in 24 hours. Of course, decades had to pass and struggles are still ongoing. But the revolution, as always, mark a horizon of possibility, open up a new road ahead. And that is what the Mexican Revolution did to its own state and also influenced the rest of the continent to do so, opening up a new road and at the same time closing a door to what was happening before, reshaping the political landscape, the political perspective and objectives of that society, and the way in which the country and the people in that nation thought of political power that did not come from the top down, but from the bottom up. That was also one of the points highlighted by the Mexican president in her address just moments ago. We were saying that November 20th, 1910 was the day that marked the beginning of struggle against the dictatorship of Porfirio Díaz, the Porfiriato in Spanish, that was summoned by Don Francisco Madero. And this armed conflict would lead to different battles, armed struggle in different regions of Mexico. Many of these led, among others, by Pascual Orozco, Francisco Villa, Emiliano Zapata, some of the most important names that would shape the Mexican Revolution and would shape the 20th century and the history of Latin America after that moment and even beyond the borders of Mexico. Their military victories forced the resignation and the going into exile of Porfirio Díaz. Porfirio Díaz went to France. He was forced to flee. But the uprisings, the rebellions, the internal struggles among different rebel factions continued and prolonged the struggle until 1917, when it ended with the promulgation of a new constitution, a key document that came from the Mexican Revolution, and where we had the project, that new national project that was birthed through that process, that Mexican Revolution that reshaped that landscape. That constitution is still the one to dictate political life and political spirit in Mexico. It's still the ongoing constitution for Mexican life at this moment. Maybe one of the most clear signs of how that Mexican Revolution that started 115 years ago continues to directly shape and directly influence the Mexico of today. Let's listen to what is happening at this moment.
9 vehículos antiguos, 503 caballos, 23 aeronaves, 3 águilas, sin novedad.
We're looking at images from Mexico again. One of the leaders, representatives of the armed forces, part of this parade. We're looking at this parade of the 115th anniversary of the Mexican Revolution. President Claudia Sheinbaum is leading this civic military parade that we've been seeing live in our images, this from teleSUR English from Mexico, in the 115th anniversary of the political process. This is the second parade that has been led by a woman in this case, after she also led the parade for the 215th anniversary of Mexico's independence. Let's recall that the role of President Sheinbaum has been so important in several aspects of Mexican life, but as the first woman president of the Mexican state, she is making groundbreaking history in every of these aspects, as we were saying in this case, leading this parades. This one, the one for Mexican independence, that had never before been led by a woman. Right before the parades that we are seeing right now was the address that we also heard live here in teleSUR English, that was going over the importance, the significance of this political process that was the Mexican Revolution. The parade that we are looking at right now is integrated by a group of over 3,000 military personnel and civilians as well, and is highlighting the role of women in the Mexican Revolution. We were just saying how President Sheinbaum has led a way of going over many of the key aspects of Mexican life from a perspective of highlighting and reinstating the importance of women's role in every aspect. In this case, as we're looking at the importance of Mexican Revolution, the importance of the role of women in that historical process. We've also been seeing, we were saying it before, a special moment dedicated to military sportsmen and women, such as those that have participated in the Olympics, and baseball players as well. The parade that we have just seen was going over and reviewing 3 key passages, 3 key moments of the revolution: the San Luis Plan, the Loyalty March, and the promulgation of that progressive constitution that set the goals to what a fair society could be in 1917. As we're looking at President Sheinbaum, that is now once again greeting, waving, leading this parade in honor of the 115th anniversary of the Mexican Revolution. She gave way to the parade with her address. She pointed out why it was so important to continue to look at and think about the Mexican Revolution and the impact that it continues to have today, how those principles continue to shape her government in particular. Then she looked upon and followed with great attention that parade that we were saying was highlighting 3 key moments of that revolution. And now we see that she continues to greet the members of the parade, military authorities. Now a musical performance, all in the context of this anniversary. Let's listen to a little bit of what is happening live in Mexico. At the events of what is happening at this moment live from Mexico at that parade was happening. Those were live images. We continue to look at how this parade is ongoing in Mexico. The parade celebrating, commemorating the 115th anniversary of the beginning of the revolution. We continue to look at images. We were just seeing how President Claudia Sheinbaum was leaving the parade, followed by the musical element and the importance, the significance of the Mexican Revolution. That was the main parade led by President Claudia Sheinbaum. We will be looking at it live from teleSUR English. Stay tuned for more in upcoming news briefs.